Thank you everyone for joining us today. The presenters for today's webinar are Joey Goldman and Gordon Hanson. Joey Goldman is a principal at Nelson Nygaard Associates with nearly 20 years of experience in planning, outreach, and marketing for public transit and transportation programs. He served as the principal investigator for the Synthesis 88, working with Gail Murray and Gordon Hanson. Joey's experience across North America includes strategic planning for human service transportation in communities from Georgia to California, shuttle and TDM planning, and redesigning public transit systems. Much of his work focuses on accessible public information. He's led the development of information tools and guides currently being used by a number of agencies to communicate transportation policies and services to the public. Joey is a member and research subcommittee co-chair of the Transportation Research Board Committee on Accessible Transportation and Mobility. Gordon Hanson, an associate at Nelson Nygaard, served as a research assistant on this project, compiling the survey results and authoring portions of the findings and literature review. His experience includes data collection, research and planning in the realm of transportation demand management, public transit, parking, site planning, and traffic analysis. Gordon received his master's degree in city planning with a focus on urban design from MIT in 2009. The format for this webinar will consist of Joey and Gordon presenting material, followed by the opportunity for you to ask questions. To download a copy of the presentation and TCRP Synthesis 88, visit www.trb.org. Now I will turn the presentation over to Joey.
Thank you very much, Lori. Gordon and I are very happy to be here with you today to talk about what we think is a fairly interesting synthesis effort that we undertook. It started a couple of years ago, actually. I should mention our co-author here on this report was Gail Murray, who unfortunately wasn't able to join us today. She is on the BART Board of Directors and has a BART board meeting at this time, so she wasn't able to participate. But I'm really happy that Gordon is here to join me today. And I should just mention one thing about Gordon. He was actually hired as an intern back when we started this effort to help us with this effort. His internship ended, and when a new position became available here at Nelson Nygaard, we snapped him up immediately. So pleased that he's back to be able to share some of the findings of this report. Let's start by just talking a little bit about what people do when they get on a transit vehicle. Who rides a bus or a train empty-handed? Really, people do go about their daily lives, and that involves carrying items, bringing items from place to place, and we see a lot of people, just as they do if they have a car to get around, fill up their trunks. People getting on buses and trains bring bags of groceries, carry children with them, carry book bags and other items. Sometimes people are pretty self-sufficient and able to board based on the transit agency's policies, in accordance with those policies, and if that includes folding up a stroller, as we see here in Austin, Texas, as somebody boarding a Capital Metro bus there, they can do so successfully. Sometimes, however, it's necessary to get a little bit of help. And here's an image of a woman who's shown up to the bus, excuse me, with a number of bags, and a passenger on the bus is getting off to help her carry her items onto the bus. Sometimes they also require assistance of the transit agency driver, and in this case we see a driver who has gotten out of his seat to secure a scooter on the bus and who's extended a ramp to allow that scooter to come on board. A lot of agencies have designated specific places for certain items. Here's an image from a BART train here in the Bay Area where they've identified a bicycle space and have a seat that folds up next to the bicycle space to accommodate bicycles. This is something that they've been looking at as they order new vehicles and as they are currently in the process of designing some new cars. Certainly we are quite familiar with buses having wheelchair spaces for wheelchairs to be tied down or other scooters or mobility devices to be secured. In many cases, transit agencies designate spaces for strollers as well in what is currently being used as a wheelchair space. In a lot of cases, buses themselves have some convenient spaces for some items. dropping a suitcase on top of a wheel well on a bus traveling in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. But in most cases, items go on the seats next to us. Sometimes they go under the seat. But I, as a regular subway rider here in San Francisco, end up asking people to please move their bags so that I can take a seat on a fairly regular basis. Sometimes items are too large to go on seats, as we know, and they end up in the aisle because of their bulk or a lack of other storage space on the vehicle. Here's a CTA train in Chicago where strollers are blocking pretty much, oh gosh, it looks like about 75% of the aisle so that they can be in front of the mothers bringing the strollers on board the vehicle. Example of a wheelchair space that's occupied with a scooter, and where else can you put the grocery cart, but that belongs in the aisle as well. Agencies have developed a number of policies, some of which they've done a pretty good job of communicating what can be brought aboard vehicles and how to handle items aboard vehicles. Sometimes they've displayed informational signs on board their vehicles, and sometimes they produce brochures and put information on their websites. We were really interested in this topic because it combines issues that we see every day as transit service planners, as people who actually do a lot of work in marketing for transit agencies, and as people who help transit agencies develop their policies, but also as transit riders who, I must confess, bring on occasion some big things on transit and deal with other people who bring big things on transit as well. So this is a synthesis of the state of the practice by transit agencies in how they manage the capacity of their vehicles when passengers are bringing large items on board. It was a survey, and we're going to review the results of that survey and some of the findings from the literature review with you today. The focus of this effort was really on strollers, carts, luggage, and other large items, but we also incorporated bicycles because it's an issue that a lot of transit agencies are dealing with. And we looked at wheelchairs as well as other mobility devices because although there are some policies, particularly in the U.S. with ADA in place on what is required of transit agencies to accommodate wheelchairs and mobility devices, there are not necessarily policies for some types of mobility aids. And we think it's kind of interesting to see what's in place and how policies that have been legislated can perhaps even be applied to other large items being brought on board buses and trains. The focus of the synthesis is indeed how space is prioritized by transit agencies, some safety issues, complaints, and incidents that transit agencies report. We asked questions regarding capacity problems on board buses and trains. We asked questions regarding restrictions and limitations that agencies have imposed on certain items. We also asked what agencies do to communicate their policies to the public, and we'll share some examples of some of the efforts that agencies have done to explain their policies and keep their passengers informed. And finally, a number of agencies identified some challenges that they face, not only in the development of policies, but also in their implementation and how they've been able to communicate those policies to the public riding their vehicles.
Hi, everybody. This is Gordon Hansen. Thank you very much for joining us today. As Joey noted, our synthesis included significant research and survey components. We conducted a review of the practice looking at different articles, previous TCRP syntheses, and even blogs to get a sense of the state of the practice. We also conducted a comprehensive survey of 42 agencies that we classified as either small, medium, or large based on the number of vehicles they operated during peak periods. As you can see, we had a pretty wide range of agencies across the nation, some in Canada. 33% of the agencies surveyed operate buses only. 62% operate a combination of bus and rail. And only 5%, 2 agencies, operate rail only. Of those, Las Vegas monorail was classified as a small operation, and the BART system here in San Francisco and Oakland classified as a large. 80% of the agencies surveyed operate paratransit as well. Just for some brief examples of the agencies that we surveyed, for a small agency, one is Brandon Transit in Manitoba. For a medium agency, Metro Transit in Madison, Wisconsin. And for large agencies, these included MARTA in Atlanta and SEPTA in Philadelphia. So Joey also mentioned that there has been quite a bit of literature, at least in the United States, on wheelchairs. This is due to the fact that in 1990, the U.S. government passed the Americans with Disabilities Act, which established a number of different federal regulations and standards surrounding wheelchairs and their accommodation in transit vehicles. Since then, there hasn't been as much direction for other mobility aids like scooters and Segways, especially Segways in recent years as they've been developed. We found that there is no national policy at all for strollers, for bicycles, for grocery carts, or other luggage, except where these items have safety impacts. But there's no rules as to mandatory placement in vehicles. We conducted a worldwide literature review, but we mainly focused on North America. We also focused on Scandinavia because of their particularly progressive policies surrounding large items. To a large extent, stroller and Segway policies we found were formed in an ad hoc fashion, usually in response to either accidents or mishaps or public debate. We also looked a little bit at vehicle technology. We found that low-floor vehicles, in particular, offer level boarding, which makes it easier for folks with larger items to get onto a vehicle. But we find that at least on buses, there is less interior room due to space for wheelhouses. I'll also mention that we had two very helpful touchstones in compiling the literature review. One of them is the status report on the use of wheelchairs and mobility devices on public and private transportation from 2008. And the other is a previous TCRP synthesis, number 62, the integration of bicycles and transit. Very helpful documents. Let's begin to talk a little bit about the large items in more detail. We'll start with wheelchairs and also mobility devices like scooters, Segways, and other such mobility devices. Oxygen tanks would count. We found that over half of the surveyed agencies see wheelchairs as an issue or a concern or a challenge. Of particular concern, 3 out of 5 agencies saw that the boarding or alighting delay caused by drivers lowering ramps and preparing a securement area was of major concern. Nearly half of agencies surveyed found that the safety of the passenger in the wheelchair was a concern as well, and about the same amount found that passing up folks in wheelchairs who might not be able to fit on a bus that is already at capacity was also a major concern. Regarding other devices, over 60% of those agencies surveyed were mainly concerned about the safety of the passenger. This may be related to the fact that there is no standard securement policies for especially newer devices. Nearly 80% of the agencies surveyed do have a limit on the number of mobility devices that are allowed on a vehicle. This is primarily due to vehicle capacity. Finally, we found that in regard to Segways, 13 agencies allow them on board vehicles. However, only 3 of them allow the general public for use for recreation. 10 of them require that Segways or riders with Segways must use them as mobility devices. We also took a look at paratransit. We assumed that many paratransit riders use mobility devices, and we wanted to see to what extent agencies permit Segways, scooters, and other mobility aids on paratransit vehicles. We found that scooters and other mobility devices are generally allowed, but partly because Segway policies and Segways themselves are still in development, there was a bit of a mixed bag. However, we still found that almost half of the agencies do permit them on board paratransit vehicles. Because these mobility devices, such as Segways and larger scooters, are still being developed to a large extent, we found that agencies generally had more flexible and/or policies that were subject to change on this issue. However, we did find that there was some guidance regarding Segways in general from the U.S. DOT. This council offered advice that agencies may develop their own policies, but they required that when a Segway is being used as a mobility device, they must be allowed to board transit vehicles.
And what's interesting here actually is part of our research included a number of case studies where we followed up with some of the survey respondents to understand how they developed their policies. And one of those agencies that we talked with in more detail was Madison, Wisconsin's Metro Transit. They saw Segways coming into focus when a local bicycle shop started renting Segways to members of the community and thought, I bet we're going to be asked to whether or not we can bring these on our buses, so let's go check them out. So they rented a couple of Segways. Staff tried getting on buses with them, tried maneuvering within the vehicles, tried securing them, and made the decision, this is a terrible idea to bring these on the buses. They're just too difficult to maneuver. They established a policy that prohibited Segways on buses, and then shortly thereafter, they were contacted by a Segway user, a young man who is using the Segway as a mobility device to get around town. He said he was aware of their policy, but said he could show them that he's able to safely bring the device on the bus. He knows how to maneuver it. So he came down to the office, went into the garage, showed everybody how it's done, even pulled a bungee cord out of his backpack and tied his Segway up as the bus took off. The transit agency staff was so impressed, they said, well, our policy has to stay in place, but as a mobility aid, we certainly will accommodate you. And the way you do it is interesting enough that we'd like to have our insurance company come and see you do this. So they invited their insurance company to see him do a demonstration. And that actually established some new insurance direction for policyholders, other transit agencies who are using Segways, to allow them to bring Segways onto their vehicles. Let's talk a little bit about strollers now. Interestingly, strollers were among the most controversial of the many large items that we addressed as part of this synthesis analysis. We did document a number of experiences of specific transit agencies. One in particular, I think, had some interesting challenges from the public in Ottawa, Ontario, OC Transpo, which had an experience whereby a mother was trying to board a bus with her stroller and a toddler. The toddler went on the bus, and the driver would not allow the woman to bring the stroller aboard based on policies that were in place. As you can imagine, the bus drove away with the toddler, and there was some outcry about that, which led to an interesting series of meetings in the community to help define what those policies might be and help figure out what might be appropriate for accommodation on buses in Ottawa. This is an ongoing issue that's impacted a number of other communities, but as you can see in this photo, there are lots of different types of shapes and sizes of strollers. This, I confess, I snapped at Disney World, which is sort of stroller heaven in a sense that there are every stroller you can imagine making its way around the park. Indeed, strollers come in versions for 2 children, for 3 children, and much narrower versions as well, as shown here is a double-wide stroller, in a sense, on a CTA bus in Chicago. There was an article in New York Magazine in 2008 that evaluated 9 different strollers ranging from about $150 to $1,000 to see how street easy they were. And individuals tested them. Some of the comments included remarks like, pulling this stroller on a bus or a subway is a snap. Others were quite challenging to make the grade. Some of the comments were that they hit a passenger in the head with one of the larger strollers. One of the testers received some assistance from a pregnant woman to help aboard a stroller on a vehicle. Other strollers ran over feet and certainly caused a ruckus on the vehicles, as you can imagine. Some strollers are designed to fold up, and some strollers are not. And some strollers, even those that are designed to fold up, may not necessarily be folded when they're placed on a bus. The literature review, as Gordon mentioned, did include an analysis, particularly looking at some Scandinavian countries where stroller access is on par with wheelchair access in many cases, in many areas on vehicles dedicated both for strollers and for wheelchairs. 64% of the surveyed agencies said that strollers were a concern of theirs. And they're really the most contentious of the large items because in many cases they block aisles. And according to respondents, 93% of them actually said that blocking of aisles is their greatest concern. Crowding of passengers, as well as a lack of space to accommodate other individuals on the vehicle are other significant concerns. We thought it was interesting that 3/4 of the surveyed transit agencies have a stroller policy in place. Only 4 of those agencies actually limit stroller size, and some of the qualitative information we received from agencies was that they really didn't want to limit stroller size because they saw that as a potential hardship on individuals, that they might have to go and purchase a transit stroller, for example. So why not allow them to bring their regular stroller on board transit vehicles? 2/3 of agencies require strollers to be collapsible, and more than 75% of them require that the child be removed from the stroller. At the same time, there were 2 agencies that required the child to remain in the stroller and be belted in with the wheels locked. So there were some questions regarding what's the safest way to transport a child that we really weren't able to answer in this synthesis. And there are differing perspectives on what's done on transit buses versus trains. In some cases, there are agencies that have different policies. For example, in Portland, Atlanta, Washington, D.C., New York City, strollers have to be folded when they're brought on a bus, but that's not the case when they're brought on a train. I should note that 2/3 of the agencies require strollers to be in a specific location on board the vehicle. In most cases in the wheelchair area, or in many policies it simply states out of the aisle. The major challenge for all of the agencies surveyed was that drivers unfortunately are not so consistent with the enforcement of policies, and I imagine that's an experience that many of you who work with transit agencies on this call may have experienced within your own agency. We did, as I said, contact a number of different survey respondents to get some follow-up information on some of the efforts that they had undertaken. And we thought the example in Contra Costa County Tri-Delta Transit was quite interesting. This is an agency that couldn't figure out why their lifts on their buses were being deployed as often as they were, because they weren't having the same number of passengers where the lifts were being deployed board and paying disabled patron fare. So they did some investigations, and they found that operators were arguing with passengers who didn't want to take their kids out of the strollers. There were some language barriers. They recognized that there were some opportunities to make some improvements in this area. So after coming up with some new policies that allowed unfolded strollers on buses, they found they were still having some conflicts between wheelchairs and strollers in particular, and decided it was time to create a stroller area. This is an example of one of the stickers that's on the buses themselves, where they've taken out one set of seats on their larger buses to create a designated stroller area. You'll see at the bottom, few stroller policies were really developed through community meetings and focus groups. This was a surprise to us. We expected a lot of these policies to be developed based on input from parents and others who use strollers, but in most cases, policies were developed based on a response from the agency to deal with how well a stroller could be accommodated on board its vehicles. Let's talk about bicycles now. Gordon mentioned TCRP Synthesis 62, the integration of bicycles in transit. A lot of agencies have done quite a bit to put bicycle racks on the exterior of their buses. In fact, some agencies have even tried to expand their bike racks with varying levels of success. I think one good example there is King County Metro in Seattle has actually been carrying bikes on their buses for more than 30 years, but seeing higher demand for bikes and on transit, they wanted to see if they could develop a larger bike rack. So they developed a 3-bike rack, which sounded good in sort of concept, but once it went on the buses, that's really when their troubles began. 6 bikes fell off their first design. A couple of bikes fell off on the freeway. And there was also concern about the bicycles blocking the headlights of some of those buses. So they went back to the drawing board. They created a new rack that's apparently working, that accommodates 3 bikes. And I think what this example goes to show is that a lot of agencies are dealing sort of trial and error. What works, something doesn't work so well, and so it's back to the drawing board to figure out how to come up with a policy to accommodate this large item. With regard to bicycles, the predominant concern of agencies, of 90% of those surveyed, was the limited capacity on their vehicles to accommodate bicycles. Another 40% said in many cases vehicles need to pass up riders when the bicycle rack either on the exterior of the bus or the capacity within the vehicle is at capacity. 13 of the 38 agencies surveyed regarding bicycles who have bicycle policies actually do allow bicycles to be brought on board their buses. 6 of them require bikes to be foldable, but not all of them obviously do. A few agencies described their policies as being somewhat informal. We thought it was interesting that both MARTA in Atlanta and SEPTA in the Philadelphia area said it actually depends on the number of wheelchairs on board the bus, and that the driver can make some determinations on whether or not additional bicycles can be brought on board the vehicles. No agencies reported that bus drivers are required to provide assistance, and in fact, about half of the agencies said that bus drivers are prohibited from providing assistance, and that includes locking bicycles to the racks in the exterior of the vehicle or helping passengers bring their bicycles on board the bus or on board the train. Almost all of the agencies that operate rail service allow for the transport of bikes on rail, but there are some restrictions in place which can really impact how effective this multimodal connection, a bicycle and rail link, really is for a lot of commuters who'd like to use transit and their bicycles. CTA in Chicago limits bicycles on trains to off-peak hours. The same is true in Montreal, for BART here in the Bay Area. NCPD, I think, is an interesting example of an agency. This is in North San Diego County that allows 4 bicycles per car. And regarding where bikes can be stored, Miami-Dade has a restriction that bicycles need to be brought into the last car only. Let's move on to our last major item to talk about here with you, and that's luggage carts and, we lumped it all together, other large items. And this includes pet carriers and skis and a whole array of different things that people do bring on their buses and trains when they go about their daily business. About half of the people surveyed from the transit agencies said that these other items are a challenge to them. So only about half. A number of agencies have defined policies to address whether or not items can be brought on board their vehicles. I thought Sioux area Metro's example of saying as many bags as the rider can carry on or off without driver assistance, they're welcome to bring on board. If the rider is a wheelchair user, as many bags as will fit on the wheelchair user's lap. Some agencies have actually equipped their vehicles for storage. I thought we might want to share with you 100% of the Lee-Tran fleet, this is a Florida transit agency, has storage space for large items. New Jersey Transit, primarily their commuter vehicles, their over-the-road coaches, accommodate underfloor storage, as one would expect with those vehicles. Lake Tran in the Cleveland, Ohio area has storage spaces on their paratransit vans, but not on their regular fixed route buses. Some agencies actually have restricted what can be brought on buses during peak periods, or highly suggest whether certain types of items can be brought on. For example, in Michigan, the MAX system in the Holland area really suggests that riders not bring items on between 2 p.m. and 5 p.m. In Montreal, again, they suggest peak hours. These items are not allowed on vehicles. One example that was interesting is what they've done for Roadrunner Transit in Las Cruces, New Mexico. There they've created a unit of measurement for the items that are being brought on buses there. And the unit is a paper grocery bag. And they've limited passengers to 4 paper grocery bags, but then they've come up with equivalents of what those paper grocery bags are like in terms of other items. 4 paper grocery bags is the equivalent of 8 plastic grocery bags, or the equivalent of 4 day packs, or 1 suitcase or duffel. And so a driver who sees somebody boarding can evaluate whether or not they have the equivalent of 4 paper grocery bags or any of these other items. We'll talk a moment about what they've done in Brandon, Manitoba, but their policies there include something like compact foldable carts can be brought along unfolded if they're smaller than a certain size so that they can be accommodated safely on board their vehicles. According to the survey, the major challenges with these other large items include the safety of other passengers, blocking of aisles, and crowding. And in fact, 100% of the survey respondents who indicated that these were challenges said the blocking of aisles is one of their major concerns. 58% of them have a policy actually that limits the size of grocery carts, suitcases, or parcels, and 71% have a policy that says those items need to be stored in a specific location. In most cases, that was out of the aisle. In some cases, it's on a passenger's lap. In other cases, it's under a seat. A number of agencies have specified what may not be brought on board their vehicles, mostly because they've had experiences where people have tried to bring these items on board their vehicles. And so you can imagine the experience of a passenger carrying a large television, a piece of furniture. Anything over 20 pounds is prohibited on Pullman Transit's vehicles. Lee-Tran found, I think, perhaps hopefully not, some explosive devices should be prohibited from buses, car rims, tires, UTA, Salt Lake City area, car batteries, gas-powered motors, gasoline containers, and those big wet bags of recycling products. Some other agencies have sort of more standard policies of what's prohibited and what's allowed. NCTD, again, in North San Diego County, allows skis and surfboards on board their vehicles, but they must be upright if they're brought on board, and they must be smaller than 6 feet long. New Jersey Transit allows pet carriers on the lap of the person riding the bus or the train. Most agencies actually allow pet carriers without designating a specific location where those pet carriers need to be. Why would an agency develop policies prohibiting certain items? Well, you never know. This is a picture from a BART train. We've got a couple of BART pictures to share with you since we're here in the Bay Area. But indeed, an individual may need to transport some items that are fairly large. This is a picture that my colleague took last Christmas time of somebody loading their brand new Christmas tree to take home with them on the BART train across the bay. Along with some bicycles, you can see it makes quite a mix of interesting activity on board that train. I'd like to talk briefly about vehicle specifications. As passengers bring more large items onto buses and trains, we found that competition really has been rising over space, particularly in the wheelchair areas. And some agencies are looking at changing the design of their vehicles and even rethinking about how space is allocated on board their vehicles. As Gordon mentioned, really there is no set of national standard for vehicle interior design. The direction from the access board is that 30 inches by 48 inches of clear space is required in order to accommodate wheelchairs and other mobility devices. So further research, some of which has been undertaken by the Rehabilitation Engineering Research Center, known as the RERC at Buffalo, have found some new data that suggests that that space should be wider and longer, recommending 33 inches by 56 inches. We asked agencies whether or not designated storage space for large items is a consideration when they're purchasing new vehicles, and in general, the answer was no. So even though there are some challenges with accommodating some of these items, it's not something that often has been entering into at least past decisions about what vehicles agencies have been purchasing. Nevertheless, we're seeing more and more that there is a trend among agencies making changes to accommodate items more flexibly, not only on their rail vehicles, but also on their buses as well. In some cases, for example, I think a good example of buses, the Walt Disney Resorts in Orlando, Florida, their new purchases of buses have been perimeter seating that allow for more flexible accommodation of strollers and wheelchairs. A lot of individuals transfer to and from wheelchairs who are traveling to the theme parks, and there certainly, as you saw in the photo earlier, are a number of strollers that need to be accommodated among and between the different parks. Not only buses, as I mentioned, but trains have been an issue in terms of how can we provide more flexible space. In the top photo, you can see an example of perimeter seating, which, as you see, opens up the vehicle quite a bit, allowing for the accommodation of not only people standing, but also some of the items that they're bringing along. The trade-off, obviously, as you can see in this photo, is that there's less seating than you would find in a train that's sort of typically configured with rows of seats. Likewise, some agencies have been installing specific storage racks on their vehicles for the accommodation of specific types of items, primarily for luggage and or for suitcases. At the same time, some agencies have designed or brought in special equipment for certain types of large items that are being brought onto vehicles. The photo on your left you can see is one of the bicycle hooks that's on the trains in the Minneapolis area, and it's the passenger securing her bicycle there. We see these same types of devices on other light rail lines, including Valley Metro in Phoenix and really elsewhere across the U.S. On the right side, I wish I could take a poll so you could all guess what that is there, but that's on a UTA bus in Salt Lake City area, one of the buses that heads up to the ski slopes, and this is a rack that's designed to accommodate skis and snowboards that these buses have been specially outfitted with.
Another component of our survey was asking agencies to evaluate their policies based on several metrics, including whether or not their policies were appropriate for the transit system, whether or not the policies were reasonable to enforce, whether they were fair to all consumers, whether they were able to maximize the convenience for consumers, and whether or not they were able to balance the agency's needs with the operational realities that agencies faced with folks bringing large items on vehicles. We asked them to evaluate that, whether or not that was true for all large items, for some, or for no large items. Between 57 and 71% of agencies agreed that their policies met the criteria for all items. Very few agencies, in fact just one, thought that their policies did not meet some criteria at all times. Some agencies said that the policies were appropriate for some items, but not for others. In clarifying this, one agency noted that vague policies lead to inconsistent application from operator to operator, and they also lead to customer confusion. We also asked agencies to evaluate the effectiveness of their policies. And you can see that from the copious amount of green, 60 to 83% of agencies found that their policies were very or somewhat effective. One agency rated its stroller policy as not at all effective. And you can see that in terms of overall policy enforcement on the right, only 21% of agencies thought that their enforcement was very effective. This may be related to the inconsistency across different operators and routes that was identified in the previous question. Now let's take a look at some of the examples of what agencies have produced to communicate their policies. Now these of course are just a few examples, and I'm sure that some of the viewers and participants today may have additional examples to share. We found overall that smaller agencies have put together policies that can be very detailed for a wide range of large items. Here you can see the grocery carry-on policy for Sioux Falls Transit in South Dakota. There's 8 points here detailing the policy for groceries. This is a handout. Here's another one, Brandon Transit in Manitoba. Here you can see that they offer both written and visual cues, as well as specific dimensions for allowable items on transit vehicles. This again is a handout. Also from Brandon Transit's handout, this gives the locations for strollers both at the front and the back of buses, which is very interesting. And they also outline here the priority of uses, arguing that for them, seniors with carts are a higher priority than parents with strollers. In this example from CATA in State College, Pennsylvania, we'll notice that policies are, in addition to being handed out in handout form or pamphlet form, they're also available online. Here's Max in Holland, Michigan, which Joey has mentioned, has a very detailed stroller and what they call shopping buggy policy. In this policy, MAX sets equivalents for strollers and shopping buggies. The equivalent of that is 2 bags of groceries. They also require that these items be capable of folding. And here you can see again that riders are encouraged not to bring these large items during rush hours for capacity reasons. Here's another example of a pamphlet provided by Valley Transit in Appleton, Wisconsin. It provides mid-level detail on a wide variety of policies pertaining to shopping carts, strollers, and even hazardous materials. Out of concern that users may not know how to ride with large items, some transit agencies have posted videos on the city and/or transit YouTube pages. These videos offer travel training about how and where riders should stow large items. These examples are from Tri-Delta Transit in Contra Costa County in California up here, showing how to bring board bikes, wheelchairs, and strollers on their buses. Also, Valley Metro there in the top right actually has an animated musical number showing how people should bring their bike for a ride on bus and rail transit. Very entertaining. And then finally, we have an example from City Bus of Lafayette, Indiana, which shows essentially called here special handling, but it shows how to bring aboard wheelchairs and luggage on transit.
So let's wrap up this presentation by talking about some of the findings from this report. And I do thank you for putting up with my fading voice. I think my fall allergies have gotten the best of me. Indeed, we found that agencies have adopted policies for a wide array of different reasons. Like they did in Madison, Wisconsin, a number of agencies were faced with a new mobility aid and needed to figure out how to bring that on board the vehicle. Passenger safety is a concern that a number of agencies expressed. And there were also complaints that have come in over and over again. In fact, 63% of those surveyed said that they had received complaints related to the accommodation or people bringing large items or even mobility aids aboard their vehicles. Other issues that have impacted these policies include insurance issues, operations issues, including those that certainly impact on-time performance. The dwell time at the stop is impacted when it takes time to board a number of grocery bags, or in some cases, a mobility device. Too many grocery bags is also a cause for concern because often drivers are asked to assist, and there are safety risks for passengers that individual agencies have identified. There are expectations for drivers to provide assistance in many cases, and policies may simply be that drivers are not permitted to provide that assistance. And certainly items tipping over is one of the great concerns that we heard, whether it's a large item falling down and hitting another passenger, a stroller falling on its side, or, you know, the bus stops suddenly and the grocery bags tip over and the cantaloupes and the tangerines go rolling down the aisle of the bus, and that makes for all kinds of havoc. Again, we noted that we expected a number of these policies to be developed based on input from riders, through surveys, through focus groups, but most agencies have really developed the policies internally based on these range of issues that we've just gone through here. We found that for most agencies, enforcement is uneven is one of their major concerns. They acknowledge that this is a fact of reality, that one operator may say, you're welcome to bring that on board. Another operator might be going by the book and saying that you can't bring that on board. That's a challenge when a passenger takes their outbound trip with the item, but then the driver for the return trip says that that's not allowed to be brought back on the vehicle. For all of the reasons that we've talked about, accommodation is certainly a challenge. We mentioned that most agencies really haven't had safety incidents. About 30% of the agencies surveyed said that they had reported accidents or safety incidents. But most agencies have identified that accommodation is a challenge simply because of the complaints that they get. The vehicle type does tend to dictate the policies. Buses are more restrictive in general due to limited space and different types of boarding requirements than trains have. Storage space tends not to be a consideration by transit agencies when they're making vehicle purchases, though this seems to be changing and more agencies seems to be looking at ways to create more flexible spaces on their vehicles. Wheelchairs and mobility devices are prioritized by about half of the transit agencies, but in the case of when wheelchairs need to board, people are not usually asked to leave the bus or to vacate the space for the accommodation of wheelchairs and mobility devices. Overall, we found that public information is relatively uneven, that there are a lot of policies and in many cases well-meaning policies in place, but not all of the agencies have done a very good job at putting the policies in writing, putting them on the vehicles, putting them on the website. We identified a few examples a moment ago, and I'm sure perhaps some of you have some good examples that you can share as well. Overall, there is satisfaction with the policies that are in place. Agencies generally think that they do a pretty good job of developing policies and enforcing those policies, even with all of these challenges. Finally, one of the roles of a TCRP synthesis is to identify where there are opportunities for additional research. And we identified just a few that I think I'll run through with you very briefly. Some things that couldn't conclusively be defined as part of this analysis is how Segways can really be safely tethered to a vehicle or even other new mobility devices, and whether and how they should be accommodated on vehicles. We hoped to answer the question about what's the right way to position strollers on a vehicle, but again, that information was inconclusive from the surveys. Additional research would be certainly very beneficial to understand, should children really remain in the stroller on a moving vehicle, or should they be removed from the vehicle and positioned in an adult's lap in many cases? We think there are certainly opportunities to identify how bicycles can better be integrated with transit, particularly through the promotion of folding bicycles on transit vehicles, as well as shared bicycle facilities, bike rental facilities that are connected with transit stops and stations. One of the big challenges, I think, is agencies can establish policies, but the question is, how do those impact an individual's ability to go about their day-to-day life? Activities, if you are traveling to the grocery store and a policy is in place that limits you to 2 grocery bags, does that mean that you have to spend more of your time going back and forth to the grocery store in order to have your needs met? So certainly there are a number of implications about what may be appropriate for policies with regard to the impacts on riders. And finally, we do see that there are vehicle configurations and new technologies to better accommodate large items, and further research on what can be done to accommodate items would be beneficial. And actually, this bullet looks like it's flipped out. Bus operators, we know, do a lot of different things when they're driving a vehicle. They're collecting fares and they're keeping their eyes on the road. And how difficult or how capable really are they of being able to take on additional responsibilities with the enforcement of policies or the assistance of passengers? I would like to briefly acknowledge the TCRP synthesis staff, particularly Donna Vlasak, for all of her help in moving this synthesis through the TCRP process. I also would like to thank the topic panel, which includes a number of individuals from small and large transit agencies and other organizations who provided input and reviewed the findings of the study as we developed them and presented them. And certainly I would like to thank Rochelle from APTA for helping to get the word out about this webinar and the document itself, and Lori, our host today, for making this webinar a possibility through NTI's work.